Here, in the sweltering desert, which borders the Mediterranean Sea, was the battleground that ran for 700 miles between Benghazi, in the Italian colony of Cyrenaica, and Alexandria, in British-held Egypt. Hellfire Pass was the setting for a battle that would last over 2 years and see the fall of an empire and the ruin of many military reputations. It was the dividing ground between Italian Libya and British Egypt. It would be here that the opening moves in the fight for the oil resources of the Middle East would be fought. Mussolini, ever ambitious to extend the domains of his African empire, created triumphal arches, recalling the once great glories of the Caesars. He coveted Egypt and chose the appropriate moment to attempt a further African conquest. Hitler had crushed France and threatened Britain with invasion. Now was the time to strike, and Mussolini gives the order to Marshal Graziani and his 200,000 men in Libya to advance into Egypt and take the Suez Canal. The Italian army sets off with cheerful confidence, equipped with weapons dating back to the First World War. Across the Egyptian frontier, the British army awaited the attack with a total strength of 36,000 men. Outnumbered, the British soldiers merely fall back. On the 16th of September, the Italian advance had pushed into Egypt some 60 miles and stopped at the modest fishing village of Sidi Barrani, which Italian propaganda turned into a major town. The Italians dug in and erected memorials to their conquest. On a December morning, the British, under General Wavell, attacked. What had been planned as a surprise raid quickly developed into a general offensive. The British reach the frontier and roll up the Italian defenses. The Italians had believed themselves safe behind their barbed wire, minefields, and fortified camps. It took only a few hours to break through their front line, and in 2 days, the whole Italian position had crumbled. The British armored forces raced forward to capture Tobruk, the principal port of the region. The significance of this victory is explained by Major General David Belcham, who was in charge of intelligence for the British Army in the Western Desert.
Now I'll show you on a map in the sand the advance after Tobruk. If this is the Mediterranean coast, the Jebel Akbar, which runs like this, and then to the east, and we say here is Tobruk, and here is Benghazi. The Italians retired along the coast road, which follows like that through Benghazi and eventually into Tripolitania. When the British forces arrived here in the area of Tamimi, the armored troops went due west in order to cut the coast road route south of Benghazi, and in an attempt to bottle up the remaining Italian troops in the Jebel Akbar. And this they succeeded in doing because they reached this area, which was called Bedafam, before the head of the retreating Italian columns. And in the event, the action at Bedafam was the end of Italian resistance in Cyrenaica.
For every British soldier, there were 10 Italians taken prisoner. 5 months after the start of Graziani's offensive, the Italian army is annihilated. Marshal Graziani is dismissed by Mussolini. But the defeat is critical, and the fascist regime is on the point of collapse. Now, it seems that nothing could stop the British pushing the Italians out of North Africa completely. The road to Tripoli seems wide open to Wavell's troops. But with total victory in their grasp, Winston Churchill sends orders from London that calls a halt to their offensive. The British government had decided that priority must be given to sending troops and material from North Africa to Greece, which had been invaded by Italy and where the Germans would be sure to follow. The British army in North Africa had to stop at El Agheila and was still there when General Rommel arrived in Africa. General Erwin Rommel arrives in Tripoli on February the 12th, 1941. With him is a small mobile force that had been hurriedly assembled, the force that would soon become world famous as the Africa Corps. An infantryman turned tank leader, Rommel had made his reputation in the French campaign of the previous summer, when he had brilliantly taken Rouen and Cherbourg. He has no experience of desert warfare, but believes in rapid movement. On his arrival, he remarks that if Wavell had continued his advance into Tripolitania, no opposition worthy of the name could have been mounted against him. The British believe that it will take Rommel 3 months to adapt to the conditions of desert warfare. It takes him only 6 weeks. His mission is purely defensive, to prevent the British from taking Tripoli. But Rommel doesn't see it like that. The same evening of their arrival, the German panzers make their way to the front line. Rommel's nature is not at all defensive. He believes that attack is the best tactic, immediate attack. Even before the rest of the Africa Corps have left the Italian ports, he attacks with the forces already landed. It's a classic blitzkrieg. On the last day in March, he strikes at the British positions in El Agheila and crushes them quickly. Wavell's forces have been weakened by the removal of the best troops to Greece. It takes Rommel only 12 days to push the British army back 500 miles to the Egyptian frontier and to wipe out all their gains of the previous month. General O'Connor, the commander of the British troops, is captured. It's through his successful use of lightning attack that the Rommel legend grows almost overnight. His personal contact with the frontline soldiers endears him to the Africa Corps, who say, to the right, nothing. To the left, nothing. In front, Rommel. He also earns the respect of the British soldiers, whose own generals are usually unable to cope with his tactics. Even British intelligence spreads his fame by distributing his photograph to frontline troops with the caption, "This man is dangerous." Back in Britain, jokes are made about the British soldiers who can manage easily against the Italians, but who have to retreat constantly when a few Germans appear. Rommel's army is in fact much better equipped than Wavell's. The German tanks are heavier and better armed. But it's his superiority in tactics that continuously pushes the British back. He's more daring and imaginative than his opponents. By April, the British had driven back into Egypt, where they had started only 4 months before. More than anything, the Germans need to control the Mediterranean. The British can harass the vital supply routes from Italy to Libya particularly by preventing oil tankers from supplying the conquering tanks of the Africa Corps. The island of Malta, a British military base midway between Italy and North Africa, is the key to the control of the central Mediterranean. Field Marshal Kesselring orders an aerial assault from Sicily. Waves of Messerschmitts and Heinkels fly thousands of sorties. Day after day the raids continue, but Malta, which experiences the heaviest concentration of bombing in the war, holds out against all odds. While Malta withstands continuous attack from the Germans, Tobruk on the North African coast also holds out. Rommel is forced to halt operations because of fuel shortage, and the Royal Navy manages to replace the Australian garrison with fresh troops, Poles, South Africans, Indians, and British. They dig themselves in around the rocky perimeter of the port like so many desert rats. The desert war becomes a stalemate. After the disastrous campaigns in Greece and Crete, Churchill pushes General Wavell into an unsuccessful attack against Rommel's Africa Corps, and when he fails, replaces him with General Auchinleck. General David Belsham and Field Marshal Lord Harding remember the situation.
General Wavell was what is known as a soldier's soldier, and not somebody who automatically got on well with politicians. Indeed, I think there were occasions upon which he and Mr. Churchill did not see entirely eye to eye. He was a man dedicated to his profession, very serious, not particularly sociable, and as a matter of fact, his great hobby was poetry. He edited a book on the subject.
I think he had an extremely difficult task. He was very much overloaded with responsibility, and he was extremely short of resources. I think he did the best he could have been expected to do with what he had available to him.
General Auchinleck, who succeeded General Wavell, came from the Indian Army, He also was a very fine-looking man with much presence, a great man, General Auchinleck, who probably, if one were to criticize or mention his great difficulties, it is in the choice of subordinates. It was he primarily who suggested General Cunningham for the command of the 8th Army when it was first formed, and not very long afterwards he personally had to relieve General Cunningham in the middle of a battle against Tobruk because of a difference of opinion about the policy for that attack.
In the battles that were to come, the 8th Army saw many changes, as generals were replaced one after another because of their failure against Rome. The British Desert Army is now very much an empire force, as it assembles in its ranks the troops of India, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. There are also contingents from Britain's allies, the Poles, the Greeks, the Czechs, the Jews from Palestine, and the growing formations of the Free French. Elsewhere, in East Africa, the British forces, aided by the 1st Free French Division, had defeated the Italians in Eritrea and Abyssinia and restored the Emperor Haile Selassie on his throne. An event which cheered the British public at home, hungry for some taste of success. Two years after the defeat of France, the French army in Africa assembles in Egypt. Soldiers from all the French colonies gather to continue the fight against the Germans. General de Gaulle arrives to review his new army, which will regain honor for France. More important than men and weapons in the desert campaign was the vital supply of water. Water, the essential element of life and war, became the greatest prize of all. To collect it and keep it demanded great ingenuity. The Germans designed a container which the admiring British copied and named the jerrycan, a word that would become part of the language. Their own water cans had not been able to stand up to the rough desert conditions. To ensure water supplies, pipelines were built and canals dug. Water trucks and storage depots were prime targets that had to be well protected. If the desert was empty of water, it had many other dangers hidden beneath its barren surface. The opposing armies had planted thousands of mines, which even today kill wandering arrows. It was the battle in the desert that first saw the use of mine detectors on a large scale. Invented by a Polish engineer, the electronic frying pans, as they were dubbed, did not always work properly, and so the old method of clearing ground by prodding with bayonets was used, a job given to enemy prisoners when they were available. It was thought that those who sow should also reap. The conditions were harsh for those who fought in the western desert. Sudden sandstorms would spring up to harass unwary campers or convoys caught in their path. The strong winds moved entire landscapes of sand, covering roads and trails, and making it necessary to travel by compass, just as one would navigate the sea. Trucks in convoy had to cling together to avoid being lost in the trackless waste. The sand penetrated everywhere and spared neither men nor animals. The intense heat, which beat down relentlessly during the day, could kill any living thing without water or shelter. Tanks became ovens and could act as frying pans, as some German soldiers proved. Perhaps the greatest scourge suffered by the desert soldier were the masses of flies that appeared whenever the troops gathered for refreshment and food. In a country devoid of any vegetation or animal life, they swarmed out to cover the men and made life unbearable for the troops on both sides. When not protecting themselves from the flies, the soldiers had to watch out for other pests, like scorpions and snakes. The soldiers who could get to the coast enjoyed the luxury of splashing in the seawater. The harsh conditions of desert fighting were softened by these occasional pleasures. Common to all the soldiers of the warring nations was the dream of home far away and of those they had left behind. It was not surprising that the one great sentimental link which came out of the Second World War was the plaintive German song Lili Marleen, which was taken up by the soldiers of both sides. The conditions, which were the same for all the fighting men, gave the Desert War a feeling of common dangers shared. The German soldiers, far from their homeland, had to adapt to alien surroundings and strange customs. The habits of the desert made them akin to the British, and mutual experiences created a mystic brotherhood. During the 3 years of the Desert Campaign, there was no home leave for British soldiers. Cairo and Alexandria were the only two cities where they could go to forget the fighting, only 120 miles away in the Western Desert. Rommel decides to take the offensive once more, and his tanks roll forward on May the 26th, 1942. He has received new and better armor and given new life to the Italian army. With characteristic speed, Rommel, the Desert Fox, unbalances the British defense by outflanking movements and attacks their static positions from the rear. In the space of a year, Rommel has come to know the desert, and he uses it to full advantage. General Koenig commands the 1st Free French Brigade entrenched at Bir Hakeim, an outpost guarding the approaches to Tobruk. He has served in Africa all his life, and is at home in the desert. Expecting an enemy attack, he has ordered 1,200 defensive positions to be dug into the rocky ground. The French force consists of 3,600 men from all parts of the French Empire. The anti-aircraft guns are manned by French Marines, and the infantry comes from the Foreign Legion. They have 50 cannons and no tanks. Rommel opens his attack on the French position by sending in an Italian armored division. The Italians advance boldly and meet the dug-in soldiers of the Foreign Legion. The French improvised an anti-tank defense by using fast-firing 75mm guns, which had first been used in World War I. Although the Italians bravely attempt to break through, they are stopped, leaving 32 tanks and armoured cars burning in front of the French entrenchments. Rommel has to reinforce the Italians with the veterans of his own Africa Corps. The Germans cut off the French and begin an all-out attack to remove the last obstacle on the road to Tobruk. The French resistance, against great odds, earns the respect of Rommel himself. He sends them an ultimatum. If they raise the white flag and surrender their weapons, they will be spared. The French reply with artillery fire. Rommel sends in Stuka dive bombers to blast the defenders from their emplacements and attacks on the ground with 2 crack divisions. In the end, the pressure is too great, and General Koenig decides to try and break out of the German grip at night. By choosing an unexpected direction, the French drive through the center of the German lines and after fierce hand-to-hand fighting, cut their way out to join the main body of the British Army 30 miles away. Rommel now has the way clear to Tobruk, but he has been held up for 10 days. The Africa Corps is determined that this time the British will not hold out in Tobruk as they did in the previous year. Now, the Germans make full use of their outstanding anti-aircraft weapon, the 88mm cannon, which has been adapted to knocking out the British tanks attempting to counterattack. Rommel urges on his soldiers, and on the morning of June the 20th, they're in sight of Tobruk. British shipping is caught in the harbour. The surrender of Tobruk is a bitter humiliation for the 8th Army. The defences of the fortress had been neglected since the siege of the previous year. Anti-tank ditches had been allowed to fill with sand, and the South African garrison had been surprised by the speed and strength of the German onslaught. Rommel and the Africa Corps capture 30,000 men and their equipment. The victory is hailed by a special communique from the High Command in Berlin. Churchill takes the news very badly. He regarded Tobruk as a symbol of British resistance. Rommel and the Africa Corps were at the summit of their achievements. A hard but generous leader, he always saw that his men shared in his successes. The soldiers of the Africa Corps set the style for the German army, and their caps became the model for the rest of the Wehrmacht. Always outnumbered, Rommel, by nerve and guile, was always a jump ahead of his opponents. Summoned to Berlin by a delighted and grateful Hitler, Rommel finds that he has become a legend in less than 2 years of desert fighting. Hitler makes him a field marshal, and the inevitable triumph of German might seems unquestioned. Rommel, the good soldier, still believes it possible to fight a gentleman's war during the reign of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Winston Churchill experiences his worst moments in the Desert War after the fall of Tobruk. He had received the bad news while in conference with President Roosevelt, and the humiliation was galling. In Cairo, the soldiers give him an enthusiastic welcome, and it seems to hearten the troubled British leader. General Auchinleck, always the professional soldier, has little regard for public relations. He shows no special consideration for Churchill when he comes to inspect operations, and the lunch served for the Prime Minister's visit is no different than the headquarters mess usually provides. Taking things in hand personally, Churchill orders an immediate counterattack. Auchinleck refuses. He has enough trouble just holding his position at the little railway stop of El Alamein. Auchinleck had carefully chosen the ground for the final stand. It was the only spot where both his flanks were secure. To the north by the sea, and 38 miles south by the Katara Depression, an impassable area of quicksand and salt marsh 200 feet below sea level. Churchill returns to Cairo in August and changes the military command. He dismisses Auchinleck. Although he had chosen to stand at El Alamein, Auchinleck would not be allowed to fight the battle. Churchill chooses General Sir Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, and Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery to command the 8th Army. General Gott had been first choice for this post, but the day after his appointment, Gott was killed in an air crash, and Churchill replaced him with Montgomery. Major General Sir Francis de Guingamp remembers.
And I remember when he got there, he told me the very first day I'd met him outside Alexandria and ridden up with him and given him a verbal report of what was happening on the front. And he told me to get all the staff assembled on the Weiss's Bridge that very evening. And I remember saying, okay, it's going to be very difficult. So he said it was got to be done. And so it was done. And I shall never forget that moment. There he was, this little man, quite white, not bronze, by the sun, as most of us were, and there he gave an oration, I would call it, which was second to none, which had the most fantastic effect on everyone who heard.
Very quickly he left his headquarters in order to make a tour of the front. Incidentally, during this tour, he used to borrow the headdress from soldiers in the various divisions. At one time he wore a New Zealand hat, another time an Australian hat, and so on. He became known as the general who wore funny headdress.
When I arrived at the headquarters of the 8th Army on the 13th of August, 1942, at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, when you take command of a large army that is at close grips with a victorious and skillful enemy, you can't afford to make mistakes. I then insisted that all existing plans and orders for withdrawal must be cancelled. If Rommel attacked, we would fight at El Alamein. If we couldn't stay there alive, we would stay there dead.
Montgomery, immediately called Monty by the men of the 8th Army, learns that his troops will be equipped with the latest tanks and artillery. Morale improves as a flood of American arms arrives. Hundreds of Sherman and Grant tanks, the only armor that can stand up to the German Panzer Mark IIIs and IVs. Now, Montgomery will benefit from his short supply lines, which stretch only some 60 miles, while Rommel's Africa Corps is 1,400 miles away from their main base in Tripoli. The British Desert Air Force is nearby, with its main airfields in the Nile Delta. The Germans are now paying the full price for not eliminating Malta. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force sink 3 out of 4 of the oil tankers that try to bring precious oil across the Mediterranean to fuel the Panzer Army. The Africa Corps is now on the defensive. Montgomery institutes a physical fitness course for the whole army. The soldiers must undergo rigorous training, and the officers, up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, must be under 30 years of age. Montgomery also saw to it that even the lowest private was carefully briefed as to what was expected from him. Churchill wanted Montgomery's offensive to start in September, but Monty insisted on a later date. He would not begin an attack without absolute superiority.
I remember one day General Alexander, who was then Commander-in-Chief Middle East, having taken over from Auchinleck, came up and arrived, and Monty took him into his caravan. He asked me to join him. And I sat in the background as usual with a pad, taking down any notes which I thought were important. And Alexander showed Montgomery a signal he'd received from Churchill, pressing Alexander to order Montgomery to carry out this offensive in September. He felt October was too late. I think one of the reasons was this coming landings in North Africa, in Algiers. And he wanted this battle to be well underway and prevent reinforcements from going over to the west of the Mediterranean. Well, Monty listened for a bit, and after Alex had said, well, now, what shall I say? Monty said to me, Freddie, give me your pad. And he took my pad and I got a pencil, and he wrote a signal. And he passed it to Alex, and he said, send that. And the gist of it was that if you want me to attack in September, it'll probably be a failure. If I can wait until October, I guarantee a victory.
The sun was setting over a darkening desert on October the 23rd, when 200,000 British troops and 1,000 tanks moved into position. Monty sent every man a personal message which stated that the battle about to begin will be one of the decisive battles of history. It will be the turning point of the war. As planned, the British guns opened fire at exactly 9:40. The Alamein barrage was the heaviest of the war. It could be heard back in Alexandria. Nearly 1,000 guns fired together. The shelling completely disrupted the enemy communication system, and the Africa Corps was thrown into confusion. The British attack did not go entirely according to plan either. The German minefields, which stretched for 3 miles, were thicker than expected, and the British tanks were badly caught in the middle. Heavy losses dismayed the first formations of the assault. The Germans fought harder than had been expected and desperately held their ground. The following day, the battle raged across the minefields and losses on both sides grew heavy. The Africa Corps lost its commander, who died on the battlefield, and Hitler ordered Rommel back to Africa from his sickbed in Austria. The British attack had faltered, and the exhausted units were vulnerable to a counter-thrust. But Rommel had not yet returned, and the weary Africa Corps could not seize their last opportunity to regain the initiative. Montgomery had lost over 200 tanks, as many as the Germans had started with. His infantry had suffered high casualties, particularly among the Highlanders, the Australians, and the South Africans. Many officers believed the offensive should be called off, but Montgomery remained resolute.
Now, at that time, I was asleep in my cabin, and my chief of staff, Brigadier de Gangor, came and woke me up and said he reckoned the battle was what he called stalling, and some pretty firm orders were necessary. He had summoned the 2 corps commanders on the northern flank to come and see me. Was that right? Now, the point I'd make here is that he did that before he came to wake me. He took the responsibility, and he was quite right. I said it was exactly right. Well, they arrived about 3 a.m. They were losing a lot of tanks. He wanted my orders to be modified. The atmosphere in my caravan was pretty tense. I think I was quite calm. When I'd heard all they had to say, I said there would be no change of any sort in my orders. The armored divisions would fight their way out. I then dismissed them all and went back to sleep.
Rommel is back in Africa, sick, depressed, and furious with the Italians who no longer supply his forces. He is disappointed by Hitler, who is willing to sacrifice his army for a few yards of sand. The panzers are thrown into a counterattack, but they are forced back with heavy losses. The British reserves are stronger than the German, and Montgomery feels that time is on his side. He decides to withdraw some of his divisions from the front line to reorganize them for the next blow. Operation Supercharge, Monty's final punch, began on November the 2nd. Tough Africa Corps fought as strongly as ever for their commander. But Rommel was down to only 35 tanks, and the British still had 600. Slowly, the Germans began to yield. Rommel saw that he must withdraw or have his infantry destroyed by the British army. Hitler ordered him to stand and die at Alamein, but Rommel convinced him to cancel these instructions. On the afternoon of November the 4th, the Desert Fox orders a general retreat, and the Africa Corps take all the remaining transport for the rush westward, leaving thousands of Italians behind. They surrender in divisions. The Second Battle of El Alamein is over, and as the British Army collect the survivors of the once invincible Africa Corps, General Alexander signals Churchill to ring out the bells, which Churchill promptly did. To impede Rommel's retreat, Montgomery sends out the Desert Air Force. Air Marshal Teller's 800 planes bomb and machine gun the retreating German columns wherever they are found. Rommel was down to 10 tanks and 10,000 men. Montgomery's commanders were all for catching up with Rommel and forcing a final showdown. But Monty did not wish to risk having to come back again like the others. Rommel was as good a general in retreat as he was in attack, and he managed to keep his force together all the way back to Tripoli. 3 British armoured divisions chased him all the way. One, the famous 7th, nicknamed the Desert Rats, had fought continuously since 1940. Past Mersa Matruh, past Sidi Barrani, through the Hellfire Pass, Rommel fell back, fighting all the way. To the delight of Churchill, Tobruk fell. On the British side, losses amounted to 13,500 killed, wounded and missing. The Axis had 10,000 killed, 15,000 wounded and 30,000 taken prisoner. It had been a killing match, a First World War battle fought with Second World War weapons. The Allies passed by the rusting remains of previous battles in their pursuit of Rommel. Benghazi fell in turn. El Agheila was reached on November the 24th, a month after El Alamein began. Finally, Tripoli fell on January the 23rd, 1943. Montgomery parades the 51st Highland Division to mark the event. Churchill arrives to the victory parade and to praise his desert soldiers.
You have altered the fate of the war in the most remarkable way. I must tell you that the fame of the Desert Army has spread throughout the world. The Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
15 major battles of the Second World War. Their impact was enormous and decisive. See newly released documentary footage on the dramatic encounters in the Atlantic and the Pacific. See the great historical battles in Russia, the Normandy landing, the bombing of Berlin, the invasion of Italy. See the big battles of World War II, the fateful encounters upon which hung the destinies of men and nations. See the big battles.